Sarikiz, the shepherd girl who became a mountain saint Balikesir, Turkey. Across the Kazdaglari range in Balikesir, in the Turkmen villages that have passed down this story for generations, there is a mountain named after a girl who tended geese, and a peak named after the moment she disappeared from the world entirely. Kazdaglari is not an obscure range. Under its older name, Mount Ida, it appears throughout Greek mythology as the mountain sacred to the goddess Cybele, and where, according to Homer, the gods themselves watched the Trojan War unfold below. That a mountain already carrying millennia of sacred association would go on to absorb an entirely new legend, an Islamic one this time, says something about how persistently Anatolians have treated these peaks as a threshold to something beyond the ordinary world. Her name was Sarikiz, and by every telling she grew up without a mother, raised instead by her father at the foot of the mountains that would eventually take her name. She became known throughout the region for her beauty, though beauty, in this story, is really only the setup for what her character would prove instead. When her father decided to make the pilgrimage to Mecca, an undertaking that in earlier centuries could keep a man away from his village for the better part of a year, he entrusted his daughter's care to the family of the village imam and left her with a simple task: tend to his geese while he was away. It should have been an uneventful arrangement. It was not. With her father gone, the young men of the village saw their opportunity. One after another, they came forward with proposals of marriage. Sarikiz refused every one of them, choosing instead to keep her word and her flock exactly as her father had left them. The suitors, unable to accept rejection gracefully, turned cruel. They spread rumors about her throughout the village, poisoning her reputation in her father's absence with stories that had no truth to them at all. When her father finally returned from his pilgrimage, those same rumors reached him before his daughter did. Troubled by what he was hearing, he climbed higher into the mountains, following reports of where she had gone, until he came upon a walled enclosure high on the peak, surrounded by her geese, exactly where she said she would be. What happened next has become the defining moment of the entire legend. Before prayer, her father asked her for water to perform his ablutions. Sarikiz poured water into his hands, but he recoiled, telling her it tasted of salt, as if drawn from the sea rather than a mountain spring. She apologized, explaining she must have filled her pitcher from the wrong source, and reached toward the valley below to draw water again. This time, when she poured it over his hands, the water was sweet, pure, impossible for a girl standing at that elevation to have gathered so quickly. Her father understood immediately what he was looking at. No ordinary daughter could summon water like that, from that place, at that speed. He recognized, in that instant, that his daughter had achieved a form of sainthood far beyond anything the village gossip could touch. As he watched, a dark cloud swept across the sky and covered the peak, and when it lifted, Sarikiz was gone. Stories of this kind, a sudden miracle of water that reveals hidden holiness, appear again and again in the folk tradition surrounding Anatolia's Evliya, the local saints venerated in villages far from any major city. Sarikiz belongs to that tradition, a woman whose sanctity was never officially declared, only recognized, retroactively, in the moment ordinary explanation ran out. Mount Ida's mythological weight only deepens the story's resonance. This was the mountain where, according to Homer, the shepherd Paris was asked to judge which of three goddesses was the most beautiful, a decision that supposedly set the Trojan War itself into motion. A range already carrying the memory of one fateful judgment involving beauty, rivalry, and a woman's fate went on, centuries later, to absorb a second story built from strikingly similar ingredients: a beautiful young woman, jealous accusers, and a mountain that ultimately decided her fate for her. The mountain where his flock of geese once grazed still carries the name Kazdaglari, roughly meaning Goose Mountain. Her peak is known as Sarikiz Legend to this day, and the spot where her father is said to have died soon after is called Baba Mountain, the father's peak. Locals still climb both summits today, leaving small offerings and quiet wishes behind, And every summer, villages across the Edremit and Balikesir region hold a Sarikiz festival in her honor, pilgrims gathering on the mountain that still bears her memory, a girl whose only real defense against a village's cruelty was simply refusing to become what they accused her of being. The Great Treasure of Ballica Tokat, Turkey. Ballica Cave in Tokat province in northern Turkey is one of the largest and most celebrated cave systems in the country, a vast underground world of chambers and formations that draws visitors from across Turkey and, increasingly, from abroad. Its stalactites and stalagmites have been building themselves, drop by mineral-laden drop, for far longer than any human story attached to them, and the cave is now protected as a natural monument, home to several species of bat that roost undisturbed in its deeper unlit chambers, far past the point where the tour lighting ends. The cave sits within a stretch of ancient limestone typical of Turkey's Black Sea hinterland, the same slow-dissolving rock responsible for karst caves across the wider region, where rainwater carrying dissolved carbon dioxide has spent an immense span of time carving out passages and depositing the calcite that, drop after drop, eventually becomes a stalactite or a stalagmite. Local guides and regional tourism materials have long promoted Ballica's stable underground humidity and temperature as beneficial for visitors with respiratory conditions, a claim shared by several other karst caves marketed across Turkey as having restorative air, though it remains a folk and tourism claim rather than a clinically established one, worth noting honestly rather than repeating as settled fact. Unlike many of Anatolia's caves, Ballica does not come bundled with an ancient legend passed down since Ottoman or Byzantine times. Its story is newer, deliberately preserved by the Tokat governorship as part of a cultural heritage storytelling project. And it is worth telling honestly for exactly what it is: a modern Anatolian folktale, crafted in the same spirit as the older legends that surround it, about greed, fear, and the price of wanting more. That distinction matters more than it first appears. Anatolia's oldest caves tend to inherit their legends from centuries of oral tradition, reshaped by every generation that retold them. Ballica instead shows how the same instinct, turning an impressive natural landmark into the stage for a moral parable, is still very much alive, even when the story itself is composed rather than inherited. The tale of Harris borrows freely from far older narrative traditions across the region: deserts crossed on faith, seas crossed on nerve, a final trial that only the truly desperate or the truly greedy would attempt. The story follows a wealthy man named Harris, a man who, despite already having more than most people in the region could dream of, wanted more still. His chance arrived when he crossed paths with a caravan traveling through from distant lands. Among the travelers was a woman unlike anyone Harris had met before, and she carried with her knowledge of a treasure greater than any he had ever imagined. She did not simply tell him where to find it, she gave him a test disguised as directions. To reach the treasure, she said, he would first have to cross 3 deserts, an ordeal that alone would have turned back most men who heard it. Beyond the deserts, he would need to reach the sea and cross it before finally arriving in Medina. And there, in Medina, his final task waited for him. He would have to reach beneath a pomegranate tree and place his bare hand into a nest of snakes. Harris, driven by a greed strong enough to override every instinct telling him to turn back, did exactly that. He crossed the 3 deserts, each one testing a different kind of endurance, heat, thirst, and the slow erosion of resolve that comes from days of walking without any promise the destination is real. He crossed the sea. He reached Medina, found the pomegranate tree, and forced his hand into the snake's nest, fully expecting to be bitten, fully willing to risk it for what waited on the other side of his fear. He survived. And by every account of how the story ends, he reached the treasure the mysterious woman had promised him, earned not through luck, but through a willingness to walk through exactly the kind of fear that stops most people before they ever begin. It is a simple story, more parable than mystery, but it endures for the same reason old Anatolian tales always have, And for the same reason, similar trial-based treasure tales recur across Middle Eastern and Central Asian storytelling more broadly. It asks a question worth asking. How much are you willing to risk, and how far are you willing to travel, for something you cannot see and have only been promised exists? Ballica Cave itself, with its own vast unexplored chambers stretching deeper into the earth than most visitors ever go, its darkness broken only by mineral formations that have grown in silence for longer than any civilization above them has existed, makes an unusually fitting home for a story about what waits on the other side of fear, for anyone brave enough or greedy enough to keep walking. The Queen of Perge, the goddess WHO ruled in stone, Antalya, Turkey. In the ruins of Perge, one of the great cities of ancient Pamphylia near modern Antalya, archaeologists have spent decades uncovering colonnaded streets, a vast Roman theater, and a Hellenistic gate inscribed with the names of the city's mythical founders. But the true ruler of Perge, the one whose image the city stamped onto its own currency for centuries, was not a king, a general, or even a mortal woman at all. She was a goddess, and the people of Perge called her their queen. Her name, in the Greek pantheon most visitors know today, was Artemis, goddess of the hunt, of wild places of the moon. But in Perge, she was worshipped under a title found nowhere else in quite the same form, Wanasa Priya, an ancient Anatolian phrase that translates roughly and remarkably to Queen of Perge. Coins minted in the city bear her image alongside this title, a rare piece of hard archaeological evidence for a form of goddess worship that predates and outlasted the classical Greek version of Artemis that eventually absorbed her identity. This was not simply a city that admired a distant deity from afar. Perge's own religious life was built around the idea that Artemis was not just a patron watching from Olympus, but the actual sovereign of the city itself, ruling in a way distinct from any mortal magistrate or king who came and went with each generation. Her temple stood as one of the city's most important structures, and her image on Perge's coinage circulated through the hands of merchants and travelers across the ancient Mediterranean world, carrying the city's unusual claim wherever that currency traveled. Perge produced Apollonius of Perga, one of antiquity's great mathematicians, whose treatise on conic sections, written in the 3rd century BCE, introduced terms like ellipse and parabola still used today, work that later shaped Kepler's descriptions of planetary orbits nearly 2,000 years afterward. A city producing that intellectual legacy, while insisting a goddess held its throne, shows how ancient Anatolians held reasoned inquiry and religious devotion together, not as contradictions. Perge's stadium, among the best preserved in Anatolia, seated roughly 12,000 spectators over arched chambers once rented out as shops. Its colonnaded main avenue ran with a channel of flowing water down its center. In the 2nd century CE, a Roman noblewoman named Plancia Magna funded a major reconstruction of the city's gate court, filling it with statues of Perge's mythical founders and gods, Artemis included, placing her own name permanently beside the goddess queen she helped immortalize in stone. Pamphylia itself sat at a crossroads that shaped this kind of layered religious identity. Wedged between the mountains of southern Anatolia and the sea, the region absorbed waves of Anatolian, Greek, and later Roman influence, without ever being fully absorbed by any one of them. Perge's language even preserved its own dialect, distinct enough from mainland Greek that inscriptions from the city are still studied specifically for what they reveal about this blended Pamphylian identity. A goddess queen with an Anatolian name wearing a Greek face being one of its clearest expressions. The city's roots reach back even further than this goddess queen herself. Hittite tablets recovered from the ancient capital of Hattusa refer to a settlement called Parha, which most archaeologists now believe to be Perge under an earlier name, pushing the city's history back before 1200 BCE, centuries before the Greek-speaking world that would later worship Artemis as Wanasa Priya ever arrived in the region. Excavations on the Acropolis have uncovered traces of habitation reaching back even further into the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age. That deep continuity is part of what makes Perge such a rewarding site for archaeologists even now. Excavation seasons continue to uncover new inscriptions, statuary, and sections of the city's colonnaded avenues, each discovery adding another layer to the picture of a city that never fully let go of the idea that its true authority rested with a goddess, rather than any mortal ruler passing through. What makes Perge's queen unusual, among the countless gods and goddesses worshipped across the ancient Mediterranean, is not that a city honored a deity. Nearly every ancient city did. It is that Perge's people described their goddess using the specific language of sovereignty, queen, not simply patroness or protector, and stamped that claim permanently into metal, a piece of political theology hardened into currency and carried across an empire. Long after the mortal rulers of Perge were forgotten, their coins buried and rediscovered by archaeologists 2,000 years later, the queen they answered to was still exactly who they said she was. Not a legend attached to the ruins, but the one the ruins were built to serve.